Welcome to the Corporate Warriors podcast. My name is Fela, and in this episode, we're going to talk about negotiation. It's an interview episode where my interviewee, Justin Wagg, is here with me. Hi, Justin. Welcome.
Hi, Fela. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Perfect. So I know Justin for quite a few years now. We've been working together on different projects. And the one thing that Justin is just outstanding in is negotiation. So Justin, just for an introduction to the audience, could you introduce us a little bit to yourself and your professional journey?
Sure, I'd love to. I've worked in digital marketing for almost 20 years now. Worked at a couple different software companies and started my own marketing agency 5 years ago. And I think throughout all of that time, there's been times to negotiate as an employee in companies, and then ultimately times after that to negotiate with clients and negotiate with employees that get hired. And so I think there's several different angles we can look at in today's topics potentially.
That's great. What would you say is your right now main stand on negotiation? How do you approach the topic as Justin?
I like to think that there's two main types of negotiators. There's negotiators who are, I call them sharks. They're very aggressive. They're type A. They're the defense prosecutors of the world, right? They're the lawyers that are going to stand up and argue everything with everyone. And then there's everyone else. And I find myself in the everyone else bucket, but I think I've learned a couple strategies that work for people that aren't type A and aren't just going to be aggressive and nasty negotiators, how you can try to negotiate the best possible deals you can without being a shark. And I think that's how I see the world. And I think the side I fall into, there's some tricks of the trade that I think we could probably discuss.
Yeah, so definitely love to. When was like the point in time that you became aware that there's different negotiation styles? Is it something that you've learned naturally, just doing the business, being in the business? Or was it something that you learned reading books? How did you come across all of this?
Yeah, this particular perspective, I think, has just been formed over time. And I'm sure there's much smarter and wiser psychological philosophies on how people negotiate versus just those two dichotomic points. But I would say probably the last 4 years in particular, I've really seen that because when I started the marketing agency, I started dealing with a lot more type A individuals because it seems most executives are often cut from the same cloth, and you get a limited amount of exposure to those individuals when you're working in a company. But when you start working with multiple companies and you see the same personality type more frequently, I think that's when I started really understanding there's these two types of negotiators.
Interesting. And when you were still an employee, do you remember any kind of situation, like a first really important negotiation that you were in, something that go really well or that did not go really well?
Yeah. I have a couple of good examples of things that went well and then also didn't go well. And looking at them now through this lens of these two things, it makes a lot of sense. So the negotiations that went well for me were typically with executives that were not sharks. You know, they were cut from the cloth of not being that way, and those tended to play well to me. The negotiations with the strong type A personalities, as an employee, I ended up usually losing those negotiations, I would say. And I think that's how I've learned to develop different strategies now to work with negotiating with type A individuals and get a little more success out of them. So,
all right. Would you mind sharing some of the stories that you were referring to, some that did go
Sure.
well and also did not go well, just for us to learn from your experience as well?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, when we're talking about negotiations in the workforce, I think most often we're talking about compensation packages, right?
Mhm.
People are working to get paid, and everyone always wants more compensation for for what they're doing. So I remember one of my first jobs that I had when I was younger. I was working with the company, and it was a defense contractor over in Europe, and so just a little background. Basically, the U.S. military has a strong presence in a lot of places in the world, but they also continue to do so in Europe. So there's military bases, and there's a full structure. And so I was working with an engineering company that offered support to NATO and to the U.S. military there. And my job was quite unspectacular. I was basically a photographer, but I was still working with them. And there was another company that had a contract, and that contract required them to have a videographer, photographer for them to win the contract.
Mhm.
So they approached me because I had the skill set and the security clearance needed, and were very, they were aggressively trying to solicit and recruit me so they could win this contract. And they made a very favorable offer, and so I went to my current employee and said, I'm thinking of leaving because they've made a very strong offer over there, which then, surprising to me at the time, then ended up turning into a negotiation that was more of a, what can we do to keep you here? And so it was my first exposure to, oh, if you have value and perceived value, people will pay for that to a certain point. And so unintentionally, I ended up basically having this bidding war between two companies because both saw the value for what they needed at that immediate moment. So that went quite well. When I left, the last company I worked for full time is a good example of a failed negotiation. This was with an individual with a strong sort of traditional type A personality. And I had aspirations that I wanted to leave, start my own business, be self-employed. I made that known to my employer, and they similarly were like, is there an offer we can make for you to stay? Can we give you a promotion and give you more compensation? And I said, well, I'm not going to not consider any offer. So it took a month before I finally heard from the top leadership in the company. Excuse me, and they gave me an offer for what they thought would be enough to convince me to want to stay. And I effectively said, it's a very generous offer, but my heart's set on leaving, expecting that would likely mean that we would do some negotiations on trying to find a package that would work. But instead, what happened was the CEO I was dealing with at the time basically said, well, if this package isn't good enough for you, then you can just leave anyways. And it was his negotiation strategy was, this is the final offer, and if that's not good enough, then there's no more discussion around it, which I wasn't familiar with, and I had never seen that type of negotiation that was so. There was no negotiation. It was an offer, and that was the extent of it. And so that went quite poorly in the sense of there was no negotiating that ever happened with it. And then I would say my business partner and I acquired a business about a year ago, and that was almost like a movie-like role of negotiating, because my business partner is type A and a shark, and that's his style of negotiating, and I'm not. But the combination of both of us negotiating for the same contract from two different vantage points to do the acquisition of this business was exhaustive, because it took weeks to negotiate this deal, but it also meant that we were playing good cop, bad cop at the same time, when ultimately we were both working towards the same thing because we were on the same side of the negotiation.
That's really interesting. Three like archetypes of negotiation, nearly, I would say. So, if we start in the front, I guess a lot of people find themselves in the same situation that you just described. You only start to understand this whole game once you are in this position, potentially even brought into the position by accident. So, I think there's different kinds of people. There's people coming out of college or just having finished their studies, and they're super pumped. And they have really high expectations of the amount of money they can do straight away in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And they become really hard negotiators, but there's no real evidence yet there for their knowledge, for their applied knowledge, in the end, applied value to the company. Whereas there's other people, just like you described, that are basically surprised by what is actually possible once they're in the situation and you didn't even want to negotiate, as you said. Was there some feeling of your side to it where you would be like, feel a little bit disappointed because effectively you've been working at the company for quite some time and apparently your value to the company was higher than what they paid you beforehand. So was there some kind of disappointment or negative feelings towards your former employer?
That's a good question. So no, but what it made me realize is being on the other side of negotiations of hiring individuals. Businesses are not charities, and unless you work for a nonprofit, the objective of a business is to make profits. So good employers will pay their employees fairly, but ultimately I think most companies will only pay as much as they need to hire individuals, right? And there are exceptions to that. There's some companies that they work with unions and there's really no negotiation because every job is a structured pay scale and this job pays this much and there's nothing to negotiate at all. But for companies that are non-unionized, it's oversimplification, but ultimately every company is going to pay the least they can for the most talent so that value ratio is as high as possible. Mm-hmm. So as an employee, I noticed what was happening. As an employer, I started realizing that is the reality. And if you have someone who's a bad negotiator, they'll get taken advantage of because of it.
Yeah, that's totally right. So, but on your side, there was no real frustration. It was just a learning moment, so to speak.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's a good attitude because I think a lot of people would be feeling resentful. And then if we are honest to ourselves, then a future cooperation is starting on a real bad foot.
I think where that resentment happens is it is often the case in business where there's discrepancies in the amount that people are paid. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when resentment really comes in. Someone negotiated very well, and even sometimes for the exact same job might get paid significantly more than someone who did not negotiate well. And when those things become knowledge that people learn, that's when I think people get disgruntled.
That is a really good point. What would you advise somebody who, finds themselves in such a situation?
If you're the one that has the lower salary and you find out?
Yes.
So I think the natural reaction is to immediately run to your employer and say, this isn't fair. Why is Bob getting paid $10 an hour and I'm getting paid $5 an hour? And then Bob gets frustrated because everyone presumably has words in their contracts that say things like, compensation is confidential and you won't share it with anyone. Mm-hmm. And it's there to protect the employer because Bob makes $10 and Joe makes $5. But I think what happens in those cases then is the employer may remedy a little bit, but ultimately will make some justification for why Bob makes $10 and Joe doesn't. It's messy, and I think it is a situation, though, that all companies run into at some point.
Yeah. And what would you specifically advise? So what comes to mind for me as a first thing would be instead of just running to the employer or the HR department, like basically like in a sentiment like being a neglected child, so to speak.
Sure.
Rather going there fully prepared, taking a look at all the things that perhaps this person has done, what I have done, and not compare word to word, but just be prepared to put out the actual value I created. Is there anything, do you
Yeah.
think that would be good, or is it too much of a, let's say, of a scholar kind of approach? Or what, is there something else that you would advise people to do?
I think what you need to consider is when you're looking at employment and compensation negotiations, there are three times when that happens. It's when you first get hired, it's when you try to leave, and it's when you're asking for a raise of some kind, right? Those are really the only times you're ever going to be talking about compensation. So more often than not, those discrepancies happen because someone negotiated better coming in when they first got hired,
Yeah.
or because they were trying to leave and the employer decided it was worth paying more to keep that person there. So, um, with that in mind, it's actually very difficult then to try to come to your employer and say, Bob's making more than me, because the answer behind truthful closed doors is, well, Bob negotiated better 6 months ago when we hired him, right? So now employers use that same logic backwards, though. When you're trying to ask for more money to start or for a raise, they'll say, well, we can only pay you this because we're only paying Joe that much, and it's not
Yes.
fair if we pay you as much as Bob then. So
Do you feel like somebody that wants to negotiate a higher salary needs to have a kind of strategy in place for each kind of situation that might be coming? So, for instance, if they say something like that, then I personally would not negotiate about my salary anymore, but then also about a change of title or position, which would justify a completely different pay range, right? Do you think that makes sense to really, let's say, prepare for all the different scenarios, what HR could reply to you? Or do you think that is making you, let's say, putting you too much in the head and not really letting you be guided by kind of, the feeling of the conversation and testing out how far can I go or when is it too much?
yeah, I think you need to know what you as an individual need to do to prepare for a negotiation. What you just described would be exactly my approach, as I would think through argument and counter argument as much as I could so that I'm reducing the amount of surprise that might come into the negotiation for something I haven't already thought about ahead of time. I think there's very passionate individuals who don't plan anything out and they just respond at the immediate moment. But it is important to plan, though, because ultimately with the negotiation, you need to know what you're negotiating for, right? If you don't even have a number in mind, or you don't know what is enough for me to feel like I can be happy with this arrangement, then you're just arguing at that point. You're not negotiating. So, and I would say, like, for me, negotiations at this point, I would say really just boil down to value and perceived value. And what I mean is, an employer is the value for an employee can often be measured by return on investment. And that's one way to look at it. But there's also intangible values that employees also bring. Are they good in the workforce? Are they going to help grow a portion of the business that may not have a positive return now, but is strategic to the development of the business? Is that employee irreplaceable? No one's irreplaceable, but is it going to take me 12 months to find someone because it's such a specialized role? So understanding through the lens of the person you're negotiating with how they're going to measure value then helps you understand how can you stack up the perceived value against how they're going to measure that value. The worst negotiators don't understand those two things. Like, how are we measuring value in this case? So they'll either undervalue themselves or they'll overvalue themselves. And, I think as someone who's hired people, you see those two extremes. You'll find someone who has low self-esteem and low confidence, and they'll come in and offer, because the first question is always, how much would you like for compensation for this role? You never put the first number out yourself. You always have the other side do it first. And So if you have budgeted in your head, this is an $80,000 to $100,000 a year salary position, and a great candidate comes in and says they'd really like $60,000 for the role, great. The negotiation's over. Let's
Yes.
hire that person, and I'll go hire Joe at 80,000 when I need a second person because Bob negotiated bad in this case. So when someone comes in and they want 150,000 for a role that's for 100, there's either a misalignment on the type of person that I'm interviewing for a role, meaning they have too much experience or too senior, or they have a misunderstanding on their own value. And I think particularly in the marketing space, there's been a lot of that happening because throughout COVID, it had a lot of marketers thinking that they were irreplaceable and could just job hunt and move around to get better jobs in different places. And as the Great Resignation ended up concluding and companies started laying people off, it really reset that perception of, what is my value as a marketer to an organization.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, that value and perceived value plays into any type of negotiation in my mind. It's what I'm delivering or what I can do for the company. How much is the company going to place value on that? And that's where you can maximize ultimately how much you can get out of that.
Yeah, that is a great point. And honestly, I've never thought about it or even reading a lot about negotiation. I hardly came across this topic. What do you advise people that are not sure? Like, what is actually my value? I don't want to undervalue myself, but I obviously don't want to be kicked out of the game for saying a number that is too high.
Yeah. Someone told me 2 years ago, and I think it's funny but true. You always, if you're put on the spot where you have to provide someone the first step in a negotiation for a number, you want something that's so expensive or so cheap that it's almost offensive, but just enough that it still keeps people engaged in the conversation. Because what happens is, the reason you don't want to be the first person is because that price is going to anchor the conversations to that. And so if your anchor is too high out of the range that someone has, they're going to simply ignore, and there's no negotiation to be had. It's too far out of range. So in the salary negotiation, we've got 80 to 100K budgeted. If someone comes in and says they'd like 115, I'm not going to give them 115, but it's close enough to my high end that there's at least a conversation to be had. And that person may end up then getting paid 105,000 is where you end up landing. But if I come in and say I want 150 and that range was 60 or 80 to 100, it's so far out that we probably won't have any discussion. So that's also part of this, the understanding is, what do I suspect the person I'm negotiating has for a range for the low end to the high end in mind.
And how can you find that out? Because normally, like very often, applicants have no idea, right, about the real pay range.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully there's websites around that do a very good job at giving you ranges on particular types of jobs, and they'll give you a low to a high on a similar job.
Mm-hmm.
Those don't necessarily mean that's what your employer's looking at, though. Those are ranges from different areas in a country, different countries entirely, different sizes of companies. One job with this, I've noticed that executive positions in particular, you can be a CEO of a company of one, but you still have the title of CEO. You can be a CEO of a company of 100,000 people, and you still have the same job title. It's an extreme example, but the term head of marketing could mean it's me, myself, and I, and no marketing team, or there's 100 people under me. So job title on its own doesn't necessarily help you understand what the perceived value is. But there's also then understanding from a company's perspective. If they're an engineering driven company, they're going to likely place more value on engineers. Um, you know, so understanding what the company's priorities are at that moment is also important.
So please, correct me if I am not concluding correctly. So basically, you would go to places like Glassdoor and you would take a look, but take it with a grain of salt and try to put it into the company's perspective, saying, try to make it as regional as possible, do some additional research perhaps in terms of how many people, for instance, would I lead, and then see if there's more granular data based on such information. And lastly, even the values of the company. So in your example, if it's like an engineering led company and I'm applying for a head of sales position, but I do have a background in engineering, I can totally consider myself on the higher end of the pay range because I have this added value of an understanding for the company's core business. Is
That's
this
right. Yeah.
perfect? That's great. That's great advice. And I think it will totally help people, especially the pages like Glassdoor. They can be really helpful, but we need to use them in the correct way. Otherwise, people come in and have this high-end understandings of salaries and then feel, resentful, like we said before, perhaps even, or feel like the company's lying to me, whereas they were just not looking at the right range and they should have not looked at that title, but another one, because in other companies, the titles work differently, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Staying in line with marketing, you could have a marketing director, and in a larger business, that might actually be two or three layers down of management in a marketing division. In a smaller company, your marketing director is the equivalent to a VP of marketing or even a CMO potentially. So, it really just depends on the size of the company and how they're structured. The other thing I would say is another way to create perceived value is to help an employer understand how you can de-risk or mitigate risks for the employer. So ultimately, whenever you hire an individual, there's a certain amount of risk that you're taking on, in the sense that, is this person going to be a right fit? Can they do what they say they're going to be able to do? And, is there other factors that this person may be able to help us mitigate risk on that another candidate couldn't? Right. So thinking through the lens of an employer, like, what risks are there in this specific job? So a good example is a salesperson. Salesperson is hired to make sales. If the risk then is, I hire a salesperson and give them 6 months to build up a pipeline, but they can't close any work, now I am at risk as a company because I've been spending money on a salary for someone who's not delivering revenue in the position they're in. So with that in mind, I would bring in specific examples to show that that's a low risk area, right? Not only have I built up this amount of pipeline at my old jobs, I've had this success rate on closing this amount of revenue in what period of time, right? And then, if that experience is closely related to the same type of industry you're hired for, that inherently reduces the risk as well for the employer, because now there's an assumption that if they can do work over here that's similar, they can do the same thing with us.
Yeah, that's a great hint. Do you, in general, also considering the different types of people? You were starting talking about that, but also talking about men and women, and it's really more about the archetype, so we don't want to go into too much detail, but overall, in your experience, you've seen a lot of people work in different companies. You've been an employee yourself, but you also hired, so you've basically seen all the perspectives. Did you see big differences? And specifically for women, can we, deduct some conclusions for them as well?
Sure. I think you said it accurately. No, I haven't seen differences between the two genders, but it's the archetypes of personalities where there's differences. So like that type A personality where I split between the two different types of groups, that exists as much with men as it does with women in the workforce. But there's similar personalities for how to negotiate and deal with. So I think there is challenges though potentially for women to negotiate because they will feel sometimes like there is a discrepancy because there are men who do hiring that don't look at the world through archetypes but rather through gender decision making, and that's so I think understanding that and having a game plan to counter that is the way to handle it, right? So, and there are some I think those are the questions you need to think through before going in. Like if I feel like there's a perception that because I'm a woman and I'm in my early 30s, I'm going to be having children soon, and therefore I won't stay in the workforce. Having a plan for how you would answer a question that can't even be asked, but is being thought, is a good way to handle those types of negotiations. And if that is the case, then be transparent about it, right? Like I think if you know that you are planning on having a family in the next few years and that's going to take some time out of your career, then make that known so it's not an assumption, but also that you can frame it to help the negotiation so that's actually not a bad spot, right? Like, if someone ends up being full-time and does a great job and then needs to reduce down to part-time as an employer, if I'm growing, that's actually a great opportunity because now I don't need to hire a full second headcount. I'm basically hiring the equivalent of a 50% person, which might be the exact right next step for the growth of a business versus making the commitment to hire a full second individual, right? So there is value potentially even in that situation, but understanding that and having a game plan for how to talk about it before going into the negotiation is what's important.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's funny, but obviously based on biology, sooner or later, this is the main difference that there is, right? I mean, that's a huge non-negotiable difference between men and women is that women do carry out the children. So this is basically something that I totally agree that we should be prepared for. And I find it interesting what you're saying because the women that I have been talking to, people just that I know or I've been working with, I think the direction everybody's going is rather to being rather lying, to be really honest and blunt. I'd rather tell my employer I'm not a person that wants to have children at all. In my mind, rather give them this impression, or sometimes they even ask, even if it's forbidden in many states or countries. I have friends that were really asked the question in interviews. And it's interesting that you say you would be transparent, but then already have a solution for it and frame it in a way that helps. And obviously, we never know. It depends on the employer, what would happen from it. But it's definitely an interesting perspective that I think is great that you put it out there.
Yeah.
How can I find out what kind of archetype I am in negotiations? Do you have any tip there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is where studying and doing tests and self-reflection helps a lot because if you understand yourself, the type of personality and the type of archetype you have, you can then understand better the strengths and weaknesses that you have in particular in ways to negotiate. And that then helps you prepare as well. What's difficult with negotiations is you don't know often the person and their personality for who you will be negotiating with till you're right in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
And some personalities blend really well where those are simple negotiations and others don't, right? If you know the person and you know the type of personality, though, that does help you then ultimately prepare in different ways because you know what to be expecting more.
Okay, that's interesting. Um, Great. Are there any specific tests that you've done or that you would recommend people doing, or just go online and see what is out there in terms of finding out your negotiation archetype?
Um, there's several. I'm like I tend to use Myers-Briggs quite a bit myself.
Mhm.
I find that the structure of it and the way they frame things makes sense, and there's enough
Mhm.
variation on the different personalities that it covers. There's some that are I find to be too they're not granular enough, and you're grouping too many different types of individuals together. But Myers-Briggs, I think, is a one that I would usually lean to first.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Um, let's continue a little bit further. What would you say, just based on your experience, what are like the three main traps that we can run into when negotiating, and what would you do to counteract?
Yeah. So the first trap is being caught off guard, I would say, which may
Hmm.
end up happening. But if you aren't prepared at all, I think anything that comes up is going to be a surprise. So again, that's why I think preparing as much as you can will help mitigate the risk of being caught off and be surprised by something. The second thing would be not knowing when to walk away. You know, some
Hmm.
people like you're so invested in finishing a negotiation and finding a solution that you end up taking a bad deal because it's a compromise that's too far of a compromise, but you made up your mind that you were going to get a deal done. And the third thing I would say is underselling yourself and also overselling yourself. You need to know where that range is and if you fit into the right spot or not.
Good. What can you do to find out where you fit in what range? Would you advise going to many different interviews, even if you're really interested in one employer only? Or how can people figure that out, especially in the beginning?
If you're doing several interviews, I think you can ask very specifically, right? Like
Mhm.
what is your range for this position? You know, and most negotiators will give you I would think they would give you a fairly reasonable answer. I would always hear what you're said though and probably think it's actually on the low end of what the true budget is. But if you're doing interviews, you can gather more information about the same
Mhm.
types of jobs that you're going to. And then, as we discussed a little earlier, you know, Glassdoor and salary.com, they'll be able to give you a macro view in the full country or multiple countries on what other people are earning similarly.
Okay. And last but not least, one question that I like to ask to my interviewees is also, is there some tip that you would like the younger Justin to have received that would have helped him to get ahead faster and perhaps, not go into every trap that is out there?
Um, I think I learned over the years to plan ahead more. Um,
Mhm.
like the first example I gave earlier, I didn't even know I was entering into a negotiation until I was in the middle of it, and so I was completely unprepared at that point. And I think that probably worked to my advantage because the employer wanted to keep me and realized I wasn't negotiating because I didn't know I was supposed to be negotiating at that point. So it was very simple of like, well, they're paying me, they want me to do this, so I guess it needs to be more than that if you want to keep me, right? Um, so I think that would be the one thing, and then um, this idea of actual value versus perceived value, that's something I've learned over the years. And if I had understood that more earlier, it probably would have helped me in both senses, not oversell myself, but also not undersell at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. Any last knowledge piece that you would like to share? Any last experience or something that you would like the audience to know?
No, I think it's everything.
Well, great. Justin, thank you so much for the interview. I think there's going to be a lot of important knowledge pieces in there for people that want to up their negotiation game. And yeah, it would be great to have you back someday.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.